Hi there and welcome to the channel, and this, the fifth installment of my recommendation series, my periodic attempts to interest you, the viewer, in literary works and their writers, which have particularly impressed me. The theme of the previous video was earthquakes. This time it's short stories which take the form of fictional letters. Now, each of these fictional letters has two things in common. Firstly, they were all produced within the modernist tradition, and secondly, they are directly concerned with the difficulties of telling the truth. So, without further ado, let's begin. The first short story is by Janet Frame, a writer whose work I was introduced to by one of the regular commenters on the channel. Thank you so much, Anna, for what has proved a wonderful discovery. So, who was Janet Frame? She was born in New Zealand in 1924, just 1 year after the death of Catherine Mansfield, New Zealand's other foremost female literary figure, and, like Mansfield, she produced work in the modernist tradition. She wrote her first collection of short fiction, The Lagoon and Other Stories, while detained in a mental hospital on a misdiagnosis of schizophrenia, and it was only the publication of this book which prompted doctors to cancel a brain operation they had scheduled for her, propelling her life along a completely different course, that of a long and distinguished literary career, during which she produced 10 novels, 3 volumes of autobiography, numerous short stories and poems, and even some books for children. Now, before reading you a passage from the story I've selected, which is taken from Frame's debut collection, which, as I said, is The Lagoon and Other Stories, published in 1952, I just want to share this wonderful photo. Now, what you see here is not Frame and her 3 daughters, but is rather connected with a 1990 biopic of Frame, directed by Jane Campion, An Angel at My Table. And what you see here is Frame and the 3 actors who played her at different periods of her life. I just thought that was too good not to share. And now I'll read you the opening of Miss Gibson and the Lumber Room. Dear Miss Gibson, I'll tell you the truth now. I'm 21 and independent and not having to write a composition once a week. The glory of the bush, the rata on fire, the last rays of the setting sun touching the hilltops with gold, the beauty of nature, the gentle zephyr caressing the meadow. Dear Miss Gibson, I was an awful liar. It's about the lumber room. Do you remember? It was partly your fault, you know. You took out a little blue book, Intermediate Composition, Hints and Suggestions for the Pupil and Teacher, and you read us a sort of essay about the man who opened the door of the lumber room and spent a long afternoon over the treasures of the past. Tears came to his eyes, I remember, and the more fragile girls in the class took out their handkerchiefs when you read that bit. His voice broke with emotion too. He stared into space. Here was the first book, now thumbed and torn with childish hands. Here was the tennis racket, his first one that his grandmother gave him. How his heart leapt with the soft white ball that he tossed into the air. Oh, Miss Gibson, it was a sad, sad essay, thoughts on entering the old lumber room. And when you had finished reading it, you said, girls, that is your subject for next week, and mind your ands and buts and your paragraphing, and Jay, mind your writing, because no examiner would ever, etc. While I went home and wrote my essay. What beautiful writing, it's so musical, and the cadences, I hope you'll agree, fit my voice so well. Now, if you'd like to read the rest of that story, the link is in the description. And if you'd like to hear an excellent discussion of Frame's debut novel, the strongly autobiographical Owls Do Cry, then I suggest heading over to Mike Reads the World and hearing his thoughts on that very book. The link to that is also in the description. Okay, time for the second short story. Our second writer is Robert Walser, who was born in Switzerland in 1878 and who produced his work in German. He's sometimes described as the missing link between Heinrich von Kleist and Franz Kafka, and I would suggest his work is of comparable quality to both of those literary giants. He was also greatly admired by my favourite writer, Thomas Bernhard, and that's how he first came to my notice. Besides reading his short stories, I've also read some of his novels, and I have one of them with me. I'll just show it to you. Institute Benjamenta, which is all about the goings-on in a very peculiar school. I intend to reread this book and review it in due course for the channel. Now, one point of similarity between Janet Frame and Robert Walser is they each spent periods of their lives in mental institutions, and during one such stay, Walser produced what is now widely regarded as one of the most visually interesting pieces of writing of the 20th century. These are his microscripts, written in code in characters barely a millimeter in height. For decades after his death, they were regarded as gibberish until finally they were deciphered and the works revealed. I'm not going to read you from this monument to obsession, but rather from a much earlier piece, The Job Application, published in 1914. Esteemed gentlemen, I am a poor young unemployed person in the business field. My name is Wenzel. I am seeking a suitable position, and I take the liberty of asking you, nicely and politely, if perhaps in your airy, bright, amiable rooms such a position might be free. I know that your good firm is large, proud, old and rich. Thus may I yield to the pleasing supposition that a nice, easy, pretty little place would be available, into which, as into a kind of warm cubbyhole, I can slip. I am excellently suited, you should know, to occupy just such a modest haven, for my nature is altogether delicate, and I am essentially a quiet, polite and dreamy child, who is made to feel cheerful by people thinking of him that he does not ask for much, and allowing him to take possession of a very, very small patch of existence, where he can be useful in his own way and thus feel at ease. This story offers a neat illustration of the internally dialogic nature of language and communication, according to the Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. That is the idea that we tailor our words to suit the person we're addressing. And what we see in this story is the job applicant has absolutely no understanding of the other, and so the process breaks down, and therein lies the comedy. If you wish to read the rest of this story, you'll find a link in the description, and I'd urge you also to read more of Walser's work. It's so varied. Some of his short stories approach the status of fairy tales, and his novels are also extremely interesting. Okay, let's move on to our final story, which is I'm Brief, the Letter, published in 1902 and written by the Austrian author Hugo Von Hofmannsthal. And in English, this story has various titles. It's sometimes called The Letter of Lord Chandos, or simply The Chandos Letter, but regardless of designation, this remains one of the foundational documents of literary modernism, and it was extremely influential on Thomas Bernhard. And what it does is inaugurate the tradition of Sprach Skepsis, a radical skepticism towards the ability of language to accurately convey meaning and represent reality. And it includes the motif of writing about not being able to write. And again, anyone familiar with the works of Thomas Bernhard will immediately recognize this motif, which he returns to repeatedly in his work. I'm going to read you a passage from the middle where the narrator is trying to explain the crisis which has overtaken him. In brief, this is my case. I have completely lost the ability to think or speak coherently about anything at all. First, I gradually lost the ability, when discussing relatively elevated or general topics, to utter words normally used by everyone with unhesitating fluency. I felt an inexplicable uneasiness in even pronouncing the words spirit, soul, or body. I found myself profoundly unable to produce an opinion on affairs of court, events in Parliament, what have you, and not out of any kind of scruples. You know my candour, which borders on thoughtlessness. Rather, the abstract words which the tongue must enlist as a matter of course in order to bring out an opinion disintegrated in my mouth like rotten mushrooms. It happened to me that, when I wanted to scold my 4-year-old daughter, Katharina Pompilia, for a childish lie she had told, and impress upon her the necessity of always telling the truth, the ideas flowing into my mouth suddenly took on such iridescent hues and merged into each other to such a degree that I had to make an effort to sputter to the end of my sentence, as if I'd fallen ill. I actually turned pale and, feeling an intense pressure on my forehead, left the child, slammed the door behind me, and did not recover somewhat until I was riding at a good gallop over secluded pasture land. If you read the rest of this story, the link to which you'll find in the description, you'll be amazed, I believe, by its richness. It has an almost infinite quality, and it reminds me in some ways of the writings of Thomas de Quincey. Okay, now I've presented all three. Hopefully you'll be able to see that they do centre upon a concern for the truth. In the first one, Janet Frame, we have the narrator, a young adult, wishing to correct the lies that they told to a teacher, but in the process perhaps telling a few more lies. Then we have the unguarded truth-telling of Robert Walser's narrator, who doesn't know how to conceal the way they regard the world and the kind of person they are. And then finally, you see in the passage I read, Hugo Von Hofmannsthal's narrator unable to reprimand his daughter for not telling the truth because he's having the devastating realization that he himself no longer knows what the truth is. So there we have it. Thematically, I think they hang together very well, but all that remains now is for me to bid you farewell in the customary fashion. So be safe, be strong, and I shall see you anon. Nanu nanu.